how are you reaching out to new clients to potentially represent them to either buy or sell their home?
First, I officially try to put into action the things that I've been learning, which entail Facebook advertising and just putting ads up and then waiting to see who raises their hand and then trying to get them on the phone.
Currently, it's putting a little bit in to try and get someone to raise their hand via Facebook ad. And then
Correct.
once they've raised their hand, you're like, all right, now I got to get them on the phone to then potentially actually meet them belly to belly. Well, that will be very relevant, the training we have today. So this is training on the first, you guys ever see it? It's on the first 30 seconds on a cold call. How I first initially, for those of you who haven't been on training before or haven't heard the story, how I firstly hooked up with Steve is I was someone who, I had a virtual wholesaling company and I paid Steve the cost of my Camry to mentor me. And when I was there in person for one of the events, he was very transparent with me. And something that stood out to me was he had 4 cold callers at the time, and it was showing me how many leads through cold calling they were generating per month. And I was confused. His cold callers were averaging about 7 leads per month per caller. And at that time, because I had just gotten started, I only had 1 employee. I soon scaled up to 3, were getting me 7 a day as opposed to 7 a month. When I came to work for him, one of the first things I wanted to do was to train cold callers to get the type of results we're doing. This was the first thing we're doing, is about getting past the first 30 seconds to avoid those sudden hangups, to go from those 40 hangups per day to 4. Why 30 seconds? For those of you who are calling now, do a lot of you just suddenly get immediate resistance? Like they just say, I'm not interested.
Yeah, I do get a lot of those. Stop calling me, take me off of your list or something like that.
One of the reasons this is happening is because you are a stranger salesperson, some kind, bugging them in the middle of the day. Maybe your number says spam likely. We want to keep them on the phone long enough, which is getting past that first 30 seconds, that initial resistance goes down. Most people are relatively decent to other human beings who they interact. But when you're just calling them and interrupting them as a cold call in the middle of the day, you annoy the hell out of them. That's just the reality, and they don't feel like you're a human being. So we want to keep them on the phone long enough for you to become a human being. So when we're on the phone long enough, we've simply engaged them as like, I'm talking to a person, rather than I can just hang up on you suddenly because you might as well be a robot. You're not a person. The wrong way to start a phone call is to sound way too enthusiastic. Hey, how are you? Nice to meet you, Mr. Homeowner. Like that really sales guy on the phone. That extreme enthusiasm that sounds really cheesy is a terrible setup. Number 2, we act like we are a stranger. We do that through our verbiage or our tones. We also don't want to sound like every other caller. So some of the techniques we do are purely intentionally because more homeowners, certainly distressed homeowners in the country, know the TTP script than actual wholesalers. That if you're using that script, you sound like everyone else.
We were actually role-playing today. We did have a question about that. So my name's Gregory. You would look up my name, it's like Gregory. But if I have people call me and they say, hey, Gregory, I already know, they don't know me. I already know it's like a cold caller. So what do you suggest when it comes to that?
So there's a reality, which is that, and sometimes the names are even wrong too. Numbers are wrong, names are wrong. You could be wrong, right? The person might want to go by Greg. It might be called a number, it's a landline, and the name says Gregory, and a lady's voice answers the phone. Do you know what I do when a lady answers the phone? I go, hey, Gregory. I do it anyway. I sound like I know you, like I didn't hear you. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had Greg. I do that anyway. The tone should sound like they were expecting the call, and I'll get into that in a second, rather than worrying too much. What happens when you do this is they hang up on you. And this is a bad scenario because if they just hang up suddenly, we don't even get to disqualify them appropriately. How do we get over this? The big technique is pattern interrupts. And this comes to, if they're used to us, they have a certain expectation for how a call should go, don't have that pattern fulfilled for them, it throws them off and they get confused. And it creates an amount of time because they're thinking. First thing we do, which is sounding like you know them, saying your own name as a question. This is your name goes up an inflection rather than down. We wait for responses. And then we get permission to then go ahead, either give our pitch, give our spiel, ask more questions. Sounding like you know them. It's always like, hey, Gregory. Hey, Greg. Hi, Greg. It's always, whatever the thing is, it's always not, hey, is this Gregory? Even though you might all know, no one calls me Gregory. On a best practice scenario, someone probably calls someone their full name at some point. The key to this is realistically your tone. You should sound like they should be expecting your call in tone. So you sound like a friend. It lowers that very first level of sales resistance. They might be embarrassed to admit they don't even know you. What can happen is you can be sort of pleasant having this tone without being overly fake. So this is not that like fake enthusiasm. Just think this person was expecting my call. How would my voice sound if I was excited to talk to this person? Saying your own name as a question. So it would be like, this is Ian? I say my name as a question. So this was the big switch because most people are like, hey, is this Max? Yeah, it's Ian, right? They're doing like that type of flow. And instead I do the exact opposite. Like, hey, Max, it's Ian? It was always like, rather than, hey, is this Max? It's Ian. It just was a complete switch. It's a pattern interrupt. It creates awkward silence because their whole process should be, do I know an Ian? Was I expecting a call from Ian? The tone should be, you should be expecting this call. That's how it should be feeling. So this can be a hard hurdle for people to get used to because you are creating intentional awkward silence purely in your tone right away, waiting for responses. This is another that can be hard because now we've just created intentional awkward silence. For those people, especially on a dialer, you're like, did I get disconnected? I'm on the phone. Like, are you still there? Hello? Or just continuing on. The key there is after we do this is to remember that silence is our friend. There's a couple benefits of this. First off, it should sound more like a conversation, not a sales call, because salespeople hate silence. They're chatty. They want to fill in the space. They want to show their expertise. The people you're speaking to will not feel heard if you're speaking over them. Let them say their piece before you speaking. That's the key thing there. 3-4 seconds goes by, silence, and then you go, so the reason I'm calling, and they just start speaking too, because after that, they had the same awkward amount of silence, and they were like, sorry, who is this? Instead, you've talked over each other. The definition of ruining this approach. Getting permission to then go on sounds a little something like this. Red X. That's not the way to do this. And the reason for that is because, first off, you sound like every other salesperson. Far more effective when you're getting permission to get them to say no to give you permission rather than a yes. We say that, I'm sorry, I probably caught you at a bad time. Now, not even is now a bad time. You want to use no as a way to get a yes. Because what happens here is homeowners, they feel more comfortable giving you permission to continue if they got to say no to you. So what if it is a bad time? Because some people might go, yeah, now it's not a good time. But it's a bad time. What was I supposed to do? So let's break down. There's really two options. We ask for a time to call them back, or we simply acknowledge and keep going. This one of asking for time to call back, I do not default to this. This is usually only if they give me a good reason. So if they go, actually, I'm about to go into the doctor's office. I'm about to get called in 5 minutes. I thought this was my wife calling. That's a good reason. They have a hard cutoff to have to go do a thing. And then we'd say, look, I understand that, yeah, I'm calling you in the middle of the afternoon on a Tuesday. If you were me, when would be a better time to call you back? We found it's the best way to have someone empathetically go into your brain to try and give you a real time. Other option is very similar. Look, I understand. I'm calling in the middle of the Tuesday. I understand it's the afternoon. And then we continue on. That's the whole thing. We just continue on. But the reason for the call today, John, is I've been trying to reach the owner 123 Main Street. Like, we continue on with the script. The reason for the call today, John, those of you wanting to sort of know what script do I actually do, how do we sound this, it's pretty simple. This is the after getting permission, this is I found to be the most effective thing if you approach your tonality right for this thing, is explain the reason for the call today name after they've given you permission to go on is I've been trying to reach the owner of, doesn't have to be the address, take out the numbers. There's no reason if English is their fifth language for them to have to try and say the numbers. And now we give them their chance to speak. From there, you can now proceed with questions to gather more information. And then you would say things like, hey, like, I've been trying to reach the owner. Do you mind if I could ask you some questions about property just so I can do this? And so the ways you do this is, hey, is it okay if I ask you some questions? But number two here, I have found this to be the most powerful single preface before asking a personal question of all time. Whether you're doing this on a cold call or anytime, you ever have a question where you want to ask about the mortgage, you want to ask about something going on in their relationship, something with their family. I don't know why, but if you say, if you don't mind me asking, and then ask a tough personal question, by doing that ahead of time, they're usually okay with it. My question that I come up with that was tough, what would it be like for your family if you didn't come home tomorrow? And people were like, that is a wild question to ask. I never got pushback if I included that line and then it's like the super hack. It's insane what you can ask if you don't mind me asking. It's absolutely wild. I wouldn't necessarily recommend it this early on here, especially for what you're doing, Max. In particular, I would say you can just discard that for this part. The takeaways here about what you guys can start implementing immediately, literally on your calls or up to the day. Assume you're speaking to the right person. this number should have been expecting my call. That principle of being like, I'm confused who's answering. Realistically, assume you're speaking to the right person and sound like a friend. It's by far the best practice to go through it the most of the time, and just adjust accordingly if they don't know. Say your own name is a question. Then wait for responses so it feels like a conversation. Salespeople want to steamroll and fill in the silence. We're creating awkward silence by saying your name is a question. Embrace that awkward silence. Let them sit in that awkward silence. Make sure it feels interactive, that they're responding to the things you said, rather than you might as well be a dialer, like a robo dialer. I mean, rather than a human being on the other end of the phone. And get permission to then start to go deep. It'll make everything easier rather than just going, yeah, the reason I'm calling is I got some questions. I saw that your property is listed here, right? You want them to give you permission to then start asking deeper questions. The mindset here is we use these techniques to get past the first 30 to 60 seconds so we can actually have a conversation with the homeowner. That's really the thing. These are pure tactics that we use all the time because it gets us the best possible results to then have more conversations when it's a cold call.